thank you, each of you, for choosing to join us and participate in this webinar today, which is really about stories. And it's come out of what, for me, is an exciting story of transformation within a diocese on the East Coast, the Diocese of New Jersey. And Suzanne is one of the folk who is a part of that diocese and its staff, but I'm going to turn it over to her just very briefly and say, Suzanne, introduce yourself. Who are you? What's your role? And tell us why you're not wearing a clergy collar this morning.
Well, I'm not wearing a clergy collar because I am a layperson. I started working at the Diocese of Newark in Newark, New Jersey about 4 years ago. In the state of New Jersey, we have two dioceses. The Diocese of Newark is responsible for the congregations in the northern third of the state. And when I first started there, I was doing some consulting on fund development. After about a year, we were working with the Missional network, and my responsibilities transitioned to guidance, oversight, project management of a variety of initiatives we were engaged in to discover what God was up to in the neighborhoods and communities in our diocese, and join God's work in those communities.
Thanks, Suzanne. And just to around that and get to why stories is that a part of what we were working on together, which will sound familiar to many of you, is how do you invite congregations to lift up their eyes from how do we save and fix who we are to discovering and joining what God is up to in the neighborhoods where they are. And we realized that a lot of that had to do with listening. And it's out of that listening that we began to get to story as a big part of listening. But Suzanne, why don't you tell that part of the story?
All right. Yes. Through intentional listening, we discovered the power of story. As we continued to listen, the power of story kept coming up. And one way that happened was through dwelling. And
dwelling in the Word.
Dwelling in the Word.
Yeah.
About 2 years ago, our diocese started with the staff, and it grew from there. We started to dwell in the story of Joshua 3. And as you are likely familiar, the Israelites led by Joshua are camped on one side of the River Jordan after having spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And God is calling them to cross the Jordan into this land that's been promised to them. So as we continue to dwell in that text, it began to form our collective imagination. God called the Israelites to cross the Jordan. We felt we were being called outside of our church buildings and into our communities. We identified with the risk and the unknown, but that phrase in the scripture that said we've not been this way before, that kept resonating with us, but also that God was going to be with you. So we continued to dwell in this, so much so that Joshua 3 was the centerpiece of our annual convention in January of 2017, so a little over a year ago. And I want you to just imagine this moment of 500 Episcopalians all dwelling in this same text, sharing with their neighbor what resonated with them in the text, what captured their imagination, how they felt the Spirit might be nudged. It was really a fabulous, fabulous moment. So coming out of that, we've been dwelling in Joshua 3 for probably 6, 8, 9 months. We decided this was now the next leg of our journey. So we decided to follow the Israelites on their next leg of the journey. And that took us to Joshua 4, where Joshua selects leaders to memorialize the story of their river crossing with stones. And you all will recognize this. When your children shall ask you in time to come, saying, "What mean these 12 stones?" then you shall tell them how you made it over. So reflecting, imagining, living into that biblical narrative, we began to ask ourselves, what stories of our diocesan journey, of this journey out into the neighborhood, of our congregation's journeys, of our personal journeys, what stories do we want to memorialize? What will we tell our children in time to come? And what do those stories mean? So that just got this imagination and questioning going within, with our staff, within our leadership, and within our congregations.
So what is it? I mean, stories, okay? You began to discover, to learn, that it was in listening to the stories that were present amongst the people themselves that you were discovering the clues to where God was at work. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So kind of on a parallel track, while we were dwelling in the Joshua stories, we were also going about a lot of intentional listening. I mentioned that Joshua 3 was kind of a focal point for our annual convention year before this past. And also at that convention, we engaged in intentional listening with all of those hundreds of Episcopalians. We did some pairing and sharing around listening to God in each other, listening to God in our neighborhoods. And coming out of that convention, this intentional listening continued. 40 or so of our congregations in one way or another participated in what we called a listening excursion, a lot of facilitated intentional listening. We had a series of youth listening events to try and discover how we might better support the youth and young adults in our diocese. And we're in the middle of a bishop search. The search committee held listening meetings around the search process. So as we reflected on all of that listening that was going on, we began to identify this spirit-filled relationship that happens between listening and sharing stories, between the storyteller and the story listener. The storyteller offers the gift of a story by being present and listening deeply and genuinely. We affirm the storyteller's experience. And it's in this dwelling in each other's stories that we believe we are beginning to hear God's story. The other thing that we're recognizing and learning is that we aren't always sure how to recognize and how to share those significant stories in our lives.
So how did you go about this? It was probably more than just, I'm going to sit with you now, tell me a story.
Exactly.
How did you go about this?
Well, it was interesting. So all of this focus on story probably came to clarity in late summer of last year. And we decided at that time that just as we had focused the January 2017 convention around listening, we were going to focus the 2018 convention around the other side of that relationship, around sharing story. So, that meant research, talking, asking, thinking of who are people we know that are great storytellers, that know about telling stories, that know what are best practices in stories. We did research, investigation. We just tried to discover how to best go about this. And we came upon an organization called Story Center that had a very, I think, profound yet simple approach to storytelling. And it was to identify a moment in your life that resonates. That's the first step. The second step was to try and identify the insight in that emotion, in that moment. What was going on? What did that moment mean? And then how was that moment impacting me? How did I feel that? How might I best be able to communicate that? So moment, insight, and emotion are what was impacting you at that time. So we did a couple things. One, we took, you know, their broad process, adapted it, designed it for our own purposes, and started to test it throughout the diocese with different leadership groups, with different congregations. And what we began to find was that sharing stories in community offered this incredible ability to connect with one another and to connect with God's active presence in our lives and communities. And Alan, if it's okay, I'm going to tell you a quick story about that.
Go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
So one of these kind of process testing gatherings, I had just been circulating in the diocese, hey, we're going to try something at convention and I'd like to try it out on some different groups. And I was invited to go to a gathering of a women's church group on December 19th of last year. So I show up, the group had all been to church, grab a quick cup of coffee at coffee hour, and we gather in the vestry meeting room. Once again, it's December 19th. So the usual reluctance and resistance that we often face when we're trying something new was a little more pronounced. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? How long is this going to last? I have family coming. I need to clean up my house. I have shopping. I have cooking. I have wrapping. We've all been in those conversations.
Yeah.
But as we went through the process, which starts with some quiet time when people are asked to identify a moment that they want to share, reflect on what was happening in that moment, and then some time to pair with a friend and share that story with one another, and then to hear back from the listener about how that story impacted them. Through that process, something changed. An intimacy, a bond, a connection amongst it was probably about a dozen women who were there. So a connection amongst the women and a palatable connection with God emerged. It was really a beautiful gathering. And we spent some time at the end reflecting on what had happened in the experience, where was God in the experience, and a woman that I was acquainted with and now consider a friend after that day said that she'd been sitting with these other people, you know, shoulder to shoulder in the pews for years, but after that day, she would never look at them in the same way. They were now connected. So that's one of the things that we began to discover in this process of storytelling. The other thing that we noticed is that, and it happened there, like the dynamic of that group changed, the connection of that group changed. Sharing stories can prompt change. The group we spent some time with, the Story Center, you know, they say a story can change everything, which makes you think. It's kind of it's an interesting thought to percolate on. So the other thing we did leading up to convention was have this group come in and facilitate an all day, full day, 9 to 5 storytelling workshop for about 6 people in our diocese, 6 or 7 people in our diocese. And out of that, a collection of short 2-minute digital stories that can be shown on the screen at convention, can be shared on YouTube. Those types of stories were developed. They contained the storyteller giving the audio. There was some music in the background and a couple, 1 or 2 photographs. That's the complexity. It wasn't a super whiz bang technical thing, a simple digital story. So we shared a half dozen or so of these at convention. And one of them was titled Church Family. And it was told by a woman named Grace. And it was about...
Just for those non-Episcopalians, what is a titled church?
So one of the stories was about a congregation that's going to close. They are no longer sustainable. And the storyteller Grace offers just this beautiful description of her relationship with her church. She starts by describing getting baptized with her sister. She was married there. There's a beautiful picture of her wedding party and her 7 bridesmaids in fuchsia dresses with big bows in the back. She talks about making coffee in the urn with her mom and sitting around drinking coffee and tea after church and eating cake. And the quote she offered was, "It was like being with family." So diocesan staff, and it's our job to kind of coordinate, orchestrate how convention's going to flow out. We were very anxious about sharing this story at convention. How would the delegation react to a church closing? Like that can be a sad story. And the reaction was extraordinary. As Grace's story unfolded, people smiled, people laughed, people wiped a tear. And at the end, there was silence. And then the delegation, nearly 500 of them, started to applaud. Grace had memorialized her congregation's journey, her journey with her church in such a beautiful way. Her story changed everything. What could have been a moment of grief became a moment of celebration. I can't quite get my head around all of that happened, but it illustrates the power that a story can have.
Yeah, thanks. We're going to, in a few minutes, invite you on this webinar to engage us in questions, particularly Suzanne, and you can write your questions on the right-hand side on the on the section that there's a chat. So we'd invite you to do that as we continue conversation right now, and we'll interact with that. Suzanne, as I listen, and obviously I've also watched, what I would observe is that you as a diocese were on a journey and are on in which you are continually learning what is it like to join with God. Yeah. And you begin with these kind of, what would I say, up in the sky, big ideas. Well, it's about listening. And that's true. So, but what you've done, I think, which would be helpful to engage with, is you've actually begun to learn how to take big ideas and ground them in practices. Yes. So what you're describing is something that's more than just, well, let's get people to tell stories.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the practices that you're learning and discovering about story and going on this journey? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Well, I think the first thing that pops to mind when you ask that question is, and I think this may have even been in the title of the webinar, but creating the spaces that offer the environment for those beautiful kind of interactions to occur does require leadership. And it's not the top-down kind of leadership. It's that creating a nurturing, safe space for people to participate in that's required. So a couple of specifics there that we have found are helpful to creating that space. I think that modeling is important. So modeling storytelling. I mentioned the workshop that we held for a couple of people. And the facilitator we invited to host that workshop, she walks in and she's just this lovely, lovely human being with this great stocking cap on. And as she's starting the workshop, you know, she takes her stocking cap off and she's completely bald. And she explained to the group that she's been fighting cancer for a number of years, and this is just who she is and what she's about. And there was that physical kind of the visual, like I'm open, I'm vulnerable, here's who I am, we're all good, we're in this together. And then she showed a couple of digital stories that are very real and poignant. And so I think that kind of sharing story to begin a story session can help. We did that at convention as well. We invited a couple of folks to preach at towards the beginning of convention. And we walked them through this storytelling methodology of moment, emotion, and insight. And we didn't have to spend more than 10 minutes. They took that and ran. They loved it. And both of them, it was one clergy, one lay person, they told personal stories, like experiences they had had in their life, and regular, everyday, relevant stories of experiences they had had that, looking back, God was with them, God was active, and they may not have known that until after. So I think that all that being said, modeling is important. At convention, our bishop also shared a very personal story. So that modeling. There's another piece that goes on here. Whenever we talk about a practice, you know, that the practice of listening, the practice of storytelling, there can be a connotation of evaluation, and we really want to try and stay away from that. Your story is your story. It's not evaluated. It's not graded. We're offering thoughts and practices and process to help prompt those, but this isn't something that's graded, right? And there's a tension there that I think we just have to be, as leaders, have to be aware of and try to reduce the anxiety around. The other thing that helps reduce that anxiety is acknowledging the concept of privacy. We discovered through a couple of these kind of test rounds with the process that, so Alan, let's say we're in a story sharing circle. We call it a story circle. And I've shared a story with you that I'm very comfortable in sharing, but I may not be comfortable having you share that with a larger group before me. We discovered that part of the process is for you, as we might be reflecting as a larger group, it's your role as the listener to reflect back to me and others how my story impacted you, how you felt God's presence, how it impacted you, either your emotions, your thoughts, or whatever, and not necessarily to share my story, because my story is mine to share.
Yeah, yeah.
That all makes sense?
Yeah, lots of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I tell a story that came out of Newark that really touched me a great deal?
Please.
This was a storytelling. There was one particular church that was wanting to listen in its neighborhood, and it went about it in, you know, the classic way, which inside makes you groan. They went and decided to set up an interview with the mayor, the fire department, and the police department. And they got there, and the mayor was there with the fire chief and the police chief. And the miss was palpable in that what the mayor and the fire department and the police chief had was a list of places where these good Christian Episcopalian volunteers could go help people. And as that was going on, the three folk in this church who are now into this process of how do we listen were going, no, that's not what we're all about. That's not what we're all about. And it was in that, as I heard the story, that they began to realize it wasn't about going to officials. It was about, as I think it was Amy who told the story, it was about how I meet a neighbor in the grocery line and begin conversation. Now that, just telling that story was massively transformative. But that's the sort of thing that you're evoking and calling forth.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Sarah Jane, there's lots of questions. Should we shift to some of that at this point? Is there?
Yeah, I think there's a number of questions, and we're going to do our best to get to them all. But just off the story that you just told, Al, and Suzanne sharing, I think Craig's first question is quite helpful. Why are stories more important than news, I believe, or facts? And how might stories be different than conversations in our habits of polarization? So how might stories be different, or how might story be different than conversation or even debate in our habits of polarization?
It's a really good question. So the one thought that jumps out to me is that news and facts, right, are important and interesting and all of those kind of things, but they don't. A story, an examined, discerned story, I think is where that connection happens, and that's where the insight and the emotion comes. Al, help me with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean several things. When you talk about facts, what came to my mind right away is how often, more often than you could imagine, when people are thinking about connecting in their communities, they come up with questionnaires. And it just makes me want to pull my hair out, because when you have a questionnaire in front of you, you're not listening to people. Or if you begin with, on the street, a conversation about, what do you think of this, name your politician, and you get into those things don't evoke. But to enter the space where you can ask a simple question that says, tell me the story about how you came to live here, or that sort of thing, it invites people into a safe space that they're comfortable in and they can engage. That to me is the power of story. And it connects us in our humanity with each other, rather than I'm giving you facts or I'm telling you facts. So that to me is a big piece of what story is about.
There's another kind of facet of that, and I saw it illustrated in one of or highlighted in one of the comments. Again, there's this relationship between a storyteller and a story listener, and that deep and generous listening isn't formulating the response, and I think that's part of the difference.
Yeah, that's huge.
What we're trying to prompt is open, generous listening, and if anything, where your intentionality around it is where is God in this?
Yeah.
How am I going to? I think there was a word like, how am I going to debate? How am I going to respond? That's not it.
Yeah, it's what story does. I mean, I'm just repeating what you said, Suzanne. For us, us being Suzanne and I, and that, it's this confidence that God is present amongst the people, both in our churches and in our communities and in their stories. Mm-hmm. It's that confidence. And so we're not going to, how am I going to convince you? Or we're going to listen. And what Suzanne's describing is that being in the place of listening without needing to prove or correct or get right, that's a practice. It's a spiritual practice, an art, and it's a skill. And what they've been doing at Newark is asking, how do we learn that skill? And how do we begin to share it with others? So there are certain assumptions that are driving everything that we're doing, which is God is present out ahead of us. And we're not going to presume to know what it is that God is doing. But if we learn to listen well, which is what Suzanne's talking about, we stand a chance of hearing in the stories, the places where God is going to surprise us. That's the power of the story.
Suzanne, you use language of a discerned story. You name something a discerned story. And there's a great question here from Kelsey. In your process of sharing stories, do you intentionally make connections to God, or do you let the stories speak for themselves? So how do you bring theology into the conversation?
Such a good question.
I think that pushes into your what's a discerned story piece too. Yeah. So what's going on there?
So I'll preface this by saying, still figuring that out, still learning. But we had, leading up to this listening and sharing stories at convention, lots of conversation around what kinds of stories should be sharing. There was some concern that, should we or should we not prompt church stories, God stories? And that it's such a good question. And where we landed, I think it is helpful to prompt a story. It gives people some direction. And the workshop we went through, this group, the Story Center, they use story prompts to help people get started. And we ended up using a prompt that was very, very open. And it's actually a quote from our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and I'll read it to you if you don't mind. We have to tell them our stories of being loved when we were lost and alone, our stories of having our minds changed, our stories of finding Christ when we didn't expect it, our stories of being confronted by a love so strong that there was no other story that could change it. And, you hear that, that's very broad and open. And what came out of that prompt was these beautiful stories relevant to people's everyday experience, but then they were people's everyday experience. And upon reflection, they began to discover where God was active in that. So I guess I would say we struggled with that. And when you're with a group of faithful people and you're intentionally listening and sharing stories, God shows up. So I think we can let that go a little bit. Yeah. God showed up. So we don't have to be as intentional about, do we need to prompt God stories? They are God stories.
So can I tell a story about that involves you, Suzanne? And I'll couch the story so that...
As long as you don't embarrass me.
This is one of the things about stories and storytelling, because they're deeply personal. But I remember the story you told me, and I'll be general enough, of how as you began to find God's life in the dwelling in the Word, you were at lunch with a group of friends who were not church people.
Yep.
And you happened to mention this dwelling in the Word. So you told the story of that experience, which was a bit of a risk. Yep. And out of that, to use your language, God showed up because those folk you were having lunch with said, tell us more.
Absolutely.
That's an illustration. No, I didn't embarrass you, did I?
No, of course not.
But that's an illustration of you don't have to have the agenda that says, if I share this story or listen to this, I have to do X, Y, and Z. it is this confidence, to use your phrase, God turns up.
Yep.
Now, I think what's going to happen, and does happen, amongst many of us as Christians, because we've not done this before, is when God shows up, under our breath, we go, oh, what do we do now? But that's a wonderful problem to have.
Yes, that may be the case.
Could I engage Holly asked the question, and just and Suzanne, you can comment on this too. She said, she believes in stories, but she's got lots of naysayers who say things like, okay, give me the goals. You've heard this before, right? What's the ROI? And what's the objectives? And I think, I'll pass this to you, Suzanne. I think what we've discovered is across, let's say, the Diocese of Newark, there are lots of those people. But if you attend to where the hunger is in people, to those who are intuitively get that this has something to do with stories and listening, and you just begin to work with them, you slowly begin to build a different narrative. And that's what does the convincing. But Suzanne, I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, I think, was that Holly's question? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Alan, you're absolutely right. It's, and something I learned from you is following the energy. So while there are naysayers, there will also be yay-sayers. Gathering with them and trying to build momentum. The other piece of that is it takes a long time. One of our clergy people out of this past convention shared with his congregation the following Sunday that it really struck him that, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have the time frames quite right, but say 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, the Diocese of Newark spent the majority of their time at convention arguing over resolutions and budgets. And, here we are that many years later, could even be 8 years later. We spent the majority of our time talking about the stories of God's active presence in our lives. And that's a significant shift.
Oh, yeah.
When we put together this process of storytelling, you get those anxious moments. And it's a 2-day convention, Friday, Saturday. So Saturday morning, we had the time when we were going to develop and share at tables our personal stories. And when it was over, our chief financial officer was like, nobody ran for the doors. It was absolutely amazing. So, it's risky. But I'd say, for the most part, there's always the naysayers. For the most part, I think it was an uplifting experience for most, but, for some, it wasn't.
Yeah. Suzanne, reflect a little bit on your way into this, particularly was as a diocesan leader inviting others in. Share some stories about how this is beginning to percolate and happen inside actual congregations. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, it's very, it's, as we talked about, the relationship between listening and storytelling is the flip side of each other. And many of our congregations, if there's, for example, a turnover in leadership, they are beginning to engage listening and sharing of stories as a way to better discern who they are as a congregation and what they might be looking for in leadership. I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for.
That's part of it. Yeah. I was I was in conversation with another Episcopal congregation, another Episcopal diocese this morning, and then a little earlier. So here's an example of how that percolates out, and the whole attending to story starts to become a part of their seeing the community. One group in a congregation were asking, how do we listen in our community? And they would tell, this is the story they were telling. And they were hanging out, this was in a small town in Connecticut, actually. They were hanging out in their version of a coffee shop. And they began a conversation with a couple of people around the table. One was an atheist, the other was an agnostic. So you got to have a picture here are two Episcopalians having a conversation with an atheist and an agnostic. Now, the joke could be, how do you tell the difference between the Episcopalian, the atheist, and the agnostic? But anyway, they had this conversation, and the two Episcopalians, because of all the stuff you're talking about, walk outside the coffee shop and said, that was a fantastic conversation. Yeah. And then they realized, why don't we carry that conversation on? It had never struck them. And they're telling the story. And so what's happened, what's percolated now in that congregation is they are hanging out in a regular way with an agnostic and an atheist around questions of, like, God turned up just because they started to pay attention to the stories of the people around the table, right? They didn't like, anyway, so that's the kind of example of what is percolating. I mean, the storyboard, people telling stories and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. People striking up conversations in the grocery line that they they've never conversations with people at work they've never had before. Yeah, it does. When you had said I was thinking in congregations, but absolutely right. People are taking risks and listening to one another's stories much more comfortably and intentionally.
Yeah. There's a set of questions there that you may want to respond to, because we've all experienced this, how somebody starts sharing a story, which is a very tender thing. And within 60 seconds, the person listening goes, oh, well, that reminds me of my story. And that's the end of it. How have you gone about helping people understand how to actually listen?
I think it's one of those, your colleague, John McClaverty, I hear him in my head often saying, you have to tell people things 7 times in 7 different ways. And being a generous and open listener is, obviously really, really important. And we say that in so many different ways, in so many different styles. There's like the picture of an iceberg, right, where you only see it on top, but unless you listen deeply, you're going to miss what's underneath. There's a great quote on listening from Krista Tippett on her Civil Conversations. I would pass around to the group if I had it right here. But so, and then the process itself can allow for that. Even when we dwell in the Word, which is about dwelling in a story, being very, and in this case, very directive with people, that you're not supposed to be sharing what your reaction was to the text. You're supposed to be sharing what your partner told you about where their imagination stopped in the text. The same thing on sharing stories, allowing for a space and time that you are going to listen to your partner's story, and then another space to reflect on how you reacted to it. So I think it's that when we talk about leadership in this kind of process. It's thinking that through and being able to gently, supportively encourage people to and for many, experiment with a different way of communication.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, I'd love to tell without one of my favorite stories of all time around this telling stories and listening. I about a decade ago, I was in Dallas, Texas, with about 40 people, and I was very eager to get out of there and get on a plane and fly home. And I had given them kind of an outline about how to have listening conversations with the people in their neighborhood. And I thought, it's easy. 1, 2, 3, just go do it. Here are some instructions. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. Do this, do this. And once I'd given out these instructions, even I was aware of the anxiety in the room.
Yep.
And I had to stop. And I had to put aside my need to catch a plane and very gently and very slowly invite some people to role play with each other how to do this. And I realized then that this listening and this storytelling, for some of us, it's become a rich way of hearing God. For a whole lot of people, it's not what they're used to. Most people hardly have anybody who sits with them or stands and says, tell me a bit of your story. Most of the time when somebody asks that, behind it, there's an ask that they're going to make. And so most people don't have that experience. Mm-hmm. And again, what I've learned, which is what you've been doing in Newark, is it's gentle. You got to create safe space. And what seems obvious is actually a huge risk at the very front end. Now, I learned that the hard way, but and it goes back to the language you've been using. It's about dwelling. Like when you dwell, you're not trying to get information. You're not trying to make somebody into something. It's being with and walking with. And that's where the story is so critical. And I had to learn, you can't hand out a sheet that says, here are the rules, here are the do's, here are the don'ts. It's way more hands-on relational on that.
Our bishop has great language around that. And in this, I told the story of the women's gathering right before Christmas last year. And I endeavored to make that gathering feel as relaxed and relational and effortless as it could. But underneath that was a thoroughly designed process and steps.
Both, yeah.
Had been months in the making.
You bet, yeah.
Steps and practices. How long do we give people to reflect on and compose their story? How long do we give each other to share their stories? What kind of preparation and prompting do we do for each step along the way? So it's that that ongoing tension, the preparation. As you say, you can't just barrel your way into it.
No.
It's definitely a thoughtful exercise that will generate the kind of sharing that we're looking for, or we're hoping.
Yeah. I want to share John McClaverty's comment too, just to pull together the last story from Alan as well as yourself, Suzanne, that in Newark, the practice of listening skills came out of the developing of dwelling practices over time. So dwelling in scripture, the Lectio Divina practices. And it was over time. Like it took quite a bit of time dwelling there together. I want to make that comment and then bring that comment of John's into Bob's question from earlier, which stories are all we have. Our lives are part of, folded into the big story, God's story. And his question is, what tools have you used that allow these moments of connection and safety along this recent experience in New Jersey? And so, Suzanne, you've just talked about all this thick research and how you've gone to the Story Center, and this feels almost kind of big and heavy. So, are there ways that are there initial steps people can take, or what would your response to Bob's question be in terms of what are some of those tools and practices? Do they require us to take courses? Are they about dwelling? Like, where do we start in all of this along the way as Christian leaders, as people who care about our church systems, our congregations, our church plants, our neighborhoods? What are some of those steps that we can be taking?
Well, if not yet, if you haven't yet, as you referenced, I think dwelling in the Word is a great place to start. And I'm assuming, Sarah Jane, there's probably something on your website that people could go to get, some kind of background and format for how to go about that. I've got all sorts of stuff that I would be happy to share, but I think that modeling might be the easiest place to start. And as leaders, modeling both generous listening and examined, discerned story sharing, I think is probably the best place to start.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think the modeling, you're right. You get dwelling, modeling. So for example, I do think there have to be some, Suzanne would be an example of this, who in understanding the power of story, also ask the question, what are the practices that cultivate storytelling? There have to be people who, in any system or congregation, who are focused on that. Having said that, it doesn't have to be complex and heavy. So the modeling, for example, you go into a board meeting or a gathering of people, or somebody asks a question and you, in my head, you sit down. That is, you create a safe, relaxed space, and you find a simple way of saying, well, tell me a story about your experience. And you're not doing that to manipulate, but to genuinely listen. And in the conviction that in the stories people are telling are lots of clues to what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And so, again, that's where I begin. And there are all sorts of places to do that in congregations and in communities. And it starts to become natural as you do it. Like I was in Toronto on the weekend, and there was a bit of a snowfall, and I went to get a coffee. And as I was coming back, there was a guy out front of the place where I was staying shoveling, and I was totally unaware. He looked at me with a big smile on his face, and he said, well, thank you. I'm glad you're so concerned. And I suddenly realized the coffee had in my hand, right? And so I went, well, I said, in my usual impish way, it's actually not for you, but I'd love to get you on. And a conversation began. It's creating those simple spaces. And then in the conversation, what you're focusing on is, how do I keep inviting this person to talk out of their experience and their story around a question? And I think if you did that, if you began to do that as a practice, say in the congregation, the second important thing is you find places, not as a pedagogue, but you find places where you go, what did we just do?
Yeah.
And you invite them to say, well, I told my story. And what happened to you as you were telling your story? And what kind of experience did that give you? And, you can ask the question I always hate asking, how do you feel? But but the point is, you are asking them to reflect on what was done, and they begin to go, it was in the story. Then you can begin to ask, how do we do that with one another? So that's kind of the way in which you begin to do it. Anyway, I probably talked too much on that. What else is this, Jay?
Yeah, I think we are getting close to the end here and have addressed, I think, most of our questions. I wanted to ask Suzanne if you'd be willing to share that Michael Curry quote. We've had
I saw that.
Requested that. Perfect. So towards the end, if you could just pop that in the chat, that would be wonderful.
Yep.
I think we're just about done unless there's any other questions. I think, actually, I do appreciate John's final comment, because I think this is a great way to conclude and finish off. And John's question is, theologically, do we believe that the Spirit of God is actively in front of us in our day? So do we believe that God is at work? And I wonder if, to conclude, if both Alan and Suzanne, you want to just leave some final remarks about why this all matters in the end of the day in terms of our vocation and our call and our response to God at work around us. If we want to just end with that, I think that's...
Go ahead, Suzanne.
The invitation.
I guess very, very simply, the forming experiences that I've shared with others around this listening and sharing stories have been just so strong and meaningful that I believe that's the kind of church we need to be doing. And yes, God is out in front of us and inviting us in to that type of church. And I find it really exciting.
Yeah. I think I'd end. I mean, I could go off in a ton of directions, but I'd end with another story that actually links with that something Suzanne said earlier. A number of years ago, not many years ago, when we began this journey together with Newark, we did a whole series of interviews, conversations, not story listening, but conversations with varieties of people. There was about 40 of them across the diocese, and reported back on what we had heard as we were gathering that information. And one of the things that I said, I remember, and Suzanne, you were in the room, the staff, was that in all the responses from across the diocese, there was hardly a mention of God and God's presence. Last week, Suzanne and I were in a room together with a lot of people from the diocese, in which the description of what people were doing was descriptions about what God was doing. And the hunger to know more and engage more with what God was doing was palpable in the room. Now that's a journey. It's a journey that came out of the dwelling, out of the Joshua texts, out of listening, and out of the stories. And so for me, theologically, to John's question, there is no doubt that the Spirit of God is active and ahead of us in doing this stuff.